What if I told you the entire universe was created with just a few words? We'll unravel the biblical story of creation, from the forming of the earth to the birth of humanity. But don't be fooled. Paradise won't last long, and you'll want to stick around to find out how everything takes a turn in this perfect world. Chapter 1: Creation, the beginning of everything. The universe as we know it began with an act of infinite power, wisdom, and love. In a realm where nothing existed, not even time, God, who is beyond time and space, spoke the universe into being. "Let there be light," he declared, and in an instant, light pierced the darkness. But this was just the beginning. At first, the earth was formless and void, like a painter's blank canvas. But God wasn't finished. He began to separate the elements. He divided the sky from the waters and shaped dry land, mountains, rivers, and valleys. He spoke again, and lush plants sprouted from the ground. Forests, meadows, and vast fields of grain began to cover the earth, each growing and thriving under the power of his words. The heavens were then adorned with the sun, moon, and countless stars, not just to give light, but to mark the passage of time and seasons. With every act of creation, God was preparing the earth for his most prized creation, humanity. God filled the seas with all kinds of life, great whales and tiny fish, each crafted to thrive in their environment. The skies were soon filled with birds, and the earth became a home for all kinds of animals, each species uniquely designed, from the lion's strength to the ant's diligence. Then came the pinnacle of God's creation, humans. The Bible tells us that God created Adam from the dust of the earth, but what set Adam apart from everything else was that he was made in God's image. He wasn't just another creature. He was meant to reflect God's character and authority on the earth. God breathed life into Adam, and for the first time, a human soul existed. But God saw that it wasn't good for Adam to be alone, so he created Eve from Adam's side. Together, Adam and Eve were placed in a beautiful garden called Eden, where they enjoyed perfect fellowship with God and with each other. They were given freedom to eat from any tree in the garden, except one, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God warned them that eating from this tree would bring death, but in every other way, their lives were full of joy and purpose. In Eden, everything was harmonious. The man and woman walked with God, stewarding the earth and enjoying the blessings of their relationship with him. But lurking in the shadows was a serpent, an embodiment of Satan, waiting for an opportunity to introduce chaos into this paradise. Chapter 2: Humanity's Fall and God's Covenant with Noah. The peace of Eden was soon shattered by temptation. Satan, in the form of a serpent, approached Eve with a question designed to sow doubt. Did God really say you must not eat from any tree in the garden? Eve explained that God had forbidden only the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But the serpent, cunning and deceitful, responded, "You will not surely die, for God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil." Eve, seeing the fruit was pleasing to the eye and desirable for gaining wisdom, took and ate it. She also gave some to Adam, who was with her, and he ate. In that moment, their eyes were opened, but instead of becoming like God in the way the serpent promised, they were overwhelmed with shame. For the first time, they realized their nakedness and hid from God. When God found them, he asked, "What is this you have done?" Adam blamed Eve, and Eve blamed the serpent, but the consequences of their disobedience were severe. They were cast out of Eden, and death, both physical and spiritual, entered the world. They were now separated from God, and humanity's perfect relationship with him was broken. Yet even in this moment of judgment, there was a promise of redemption. God cursed the serpent and declared that one day a descendant of Eve would crush the serpent's head, a foreshadowing of the future Messiah who would defeat Satan and sin once and for all. As time passed, humanity grew in number, but so did sin. Cain, the firstborn son of Adam and Eve, became jealous of his brother Abel because God favored Abel's sacrifice. In a fit of rage, Cain murdered Abel, marking the first instance of bloodshed in human history. Sin spread like wildfire, and the world became filled with violence and corruption. Seeing the wickedness of humanity, God decided to cleanse the earth with a great flood. But there was one man who found favor in God's eyes: Noah. God instructed Noah to build an ark, a massive boat that would save him, his family, and a remnant of the earth's creatures from the coming flood. Despite being mocked by those around him, Noah obeyed. When the floodwaters came, they destroyed everything. But Noah, his family, and the animals were safe inside the ark. After the flood, God made a covenant with Noah, symbolized by a rainbow, promising never again to destroy the earth by flood. However, sin still remained in the human heart. As the generations passed, people continued to turn away from God. But amidst the darkness, God began laying the foundation for his ultimate plan of redemption, and it started with a man named Abraham. Chapter 3. God's promise to Abraham and the formation of Israel. After the flood, humanity continued to grow and spread across the earth, but the problem of sin persisted. Despite this, God had not given up on his creation. He chose to begin a new chapter in his redemptive plan through a man named Abraham. Abraham, originally called Abram, lived in a city called Ur, in a culture filled with idol worship. Yet, God called him to leave his homeland and his family, promising to make him the father of a great nation. "I will bless you," God said, "and through you, all the nations of the earth will be blessed." It was an incredible promise, but there was one problem. Sarah, Abraham's wife, was barren. How could Abraham become the father of a nation if he had no children? Despite this, Abraham believed God. His faith was counted to him as righteousness, and God made a covenant with him, promising that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. This promise wasn't just about Abraham's family. It was about the Messiah who would come through his lineage and bless the entire world. But like all humans, Abraham had moments of doubt. At one point, he and Sarah became impatient and decided to take matters into their own hands. Sarah gave her maidservant Hagar to Abraham, and Hagar bore a son named Ishmael. However, this was not the child through whom God's promise would be fulfilled. Years later, when both Abraham and Sarah were well past the age of having children, God miraculously gave them a son named Isaac. Isaac was the child of the promise, and through him, God's covenant would continue. Yet, Abraham's faith was tested once more when God asked him to sacrifice Isaac on Mount Moriah. In an act of incredible faith, Abraham prepared to obey, but at the last moment, God provided a ram as a substitute, sparing Isaac's life. This event foreshadowed the ultimate sacrifice that God would one day make for humanity. Isaac grew up and married Rebekah, and they had two sons, Esau and Jacob. Though Jacob was the younger of the two, God chose him to carry on the covenant. After a transformative encounter with God, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and he became the father of 12 sons, who would form the 12 tribes of Israel. However, Jacob's family was far from perfect. His sons became jealous of their brother Joseph, who was favored by their father, and sold him into slavery in Egypt. But what they intended for evil, God used for good. Joseph rose to power in Egypt, and through his God-given wisdom, saved the nation from a devastating famine. When his brothers came to Egypt seeking food, Joseph forgave them and brought his family to live with him, setting the stage for the next chapter of Israel's story. Chapter 4. The Exodus and the Law. After Joseph's death, the Israelites, Jacob's descendants, remained in Egypt, where they grew into a large and prosperous nation. However, as time passed, a new pharaoh came to power who did not know Joseph and saw the Israelites as a threat. In response, he enslaved them and subjected them to brutal labor. For 400 years, the Israelites cried out to God for deliverance, and he heard their pleas. God raised up Moses, an unlikely leader, to deliver his people. Moses, born into an Israelite family but raised in the palace of Pharaoh, fled Egypt after killing an Egyptian who was beating a fellow Israelite. He spent years in exile, living as a shepherd, until one day God appeared to him in the form of a burning bush. God commanded Moses to return to Egypt and demand that Pharaoh release the Israelites. Despite his fear and doubts, Moses obeyed. When he confronted Pharaoh with God's command, "Let my people go," Pharaoh's heart was hardened. To demonstrate his power and force, Pharaoh to comply, God sent a series of 10 plagues upon Egypt, each one targeting the gods and economy of the Egyptians. The final plague was the most devastating, the death of the firstborn. But the Israelites were spared through the blood of a lamb, which they were instructed to spread on the doorposts of their homes. This event became known as the First Passover. Finally, Pharaoh relented, and the Israelites began their journey to the Promised Land. But Pharaoh quickly changed his mind and pursued them with his army. Trapped between the Red Sea and the approaching Egyptian soldiers, the Israelites seemed doomed. But God performed another miracle. He parted the waters of the Red Sea, allowing the Israelites to cross on dry land. When the Egyptians followed, the waters closed in on them, drowning the entire army. Free at last, the Israelites traveled through the wilderness where God provided for their every need. Manna from heaven, water from rocks, and guidance through a pillar of cloud by day and a pillar of fire by night. Along the way, they stopped at Mount Sinai, where God gave them the 10 Commandments and established the Mosaic Covenant. These laws were designed to shape the Israelites into a holy nation, set apart to reflect God's character to the world. However, even as Moses was receiving the law, the people grew impatient and worshipped a golden calf, breaking their covenant with God. Despite this, God remained faithful. He continued to lead them toward the promised land, though their journey was delayed by their lack of faith. In the next chapter, we'll see how the Israelites finally enter the promised land under Joshua's leadership and how the cycle of faith and disobedience continues during the time of the judges. After 40 years of wandering in the wilderness due to their lack of faith, the Israelites finally stood on the threshold of the promised land. But this land, known as Canaan, was already inhabited by powerful nations with fortified cities and well-armed armies. Yet God had promised that He would go before them and give them victory if they trusted Him. Under the leadership of Joshua, Moses' successor, the Israelites crossed the Jordan River and began the conquest of Canaan. Their first major challenge was the city of Jericho, with its towering walls that seemed impossible to breach. But God had a plan. He instructed the Israelites to march around the city once a day for 6 days, and on the 7th day, they were to march around it 7 times while blowing trumpets. When they did, the walls of Jericho collapsed, and the Israelites were able to take the city without a fight. This miraculous victory was a sign that God was with them, and it filled the people with confidence. However, the conquest of Canaan was not without challenges. The Israelites were instructed to destroy the idols and false gods of the Canaanites, but they often failed to do so. This disobedience led to a cycle of sin and temptation that would have lasting consequences for future generations. Still, Joshua led the Israelites to many victories, and much of the promised land was brought under their control. But after Joshua's death, Israel fell into a troubling pattern. Without a strong leader to guide them, the people turned away from God and began worshiping the false gods of the nations around them. As a result, God allowed their enemies to oppress them. Yet, when the Israelites cried out to Him, God, in His mercy, raised up judges to deliver them. These judges were not kings, but military leaders and prophets who brought temporary peace to the land. One of the most famous judges was Gideon, who, despite his fear, led a tiny army of 300 men to victory against the Midianites, demonstrating that God could win battles without large armies. Another judge, Samson, was known for his incredible strength, which God had given him to fight against the Philistines. But even Samson's strength couldn't keep him from falling into sin, which ultimately led to his downfall. The period of the judges was marked by instability and chaos. The Israelites repeatedly turned away from God, only to face disaster. Yet through it all, God remained faithful to His covenant. As the people longed for stability, they began to cry out for a king to rule over them, just like the other nations. In the next chapter, we'll see how God responds to their request by giving them their first king, Saul, and later, the rise of David, a shepherd boy who would change the course of Israel's history forever. Chapter 6. The Rise and Fall of the Kings, David and Solomon. As the period of the judges came to a close, the Israelites grew tired of the constant cycle of sin and Cain. They wanted stability and longed to be like the nations around them, with a king to rule over them. Despite God's warnings that a king would bring taxes, war, and potential oppression, the people insisted. So God granted their request and chose Saul, a tall and handsome man, to be their first king. At first, Saul seemed like a strong leader. He won battles and united the people, but over time, his pride and disobedience led to his downfall. When Saul refused to fully obey God's commands, God rejected him as king and chose a new leader, David, a humble shepherd boy from the tribe of Judah. David's rise to fame began when he faced the Philistine giant Goliath in battle. Armed with only a slingshot and a few stones, David defeated the towering warrior with a single shot, bringing victory to Israel. This triumph made David a national hero, but it also stirred jealousy in King Saul. Saul saw David's growing popularity as a threat and tried to kill him multiple times, forcing David to flee and live as a fugitive for years. Despite the danger and hardships, David never lost his faith in God. He had multiple opportunities to kill Saul and claim the throne, but each time he refused, saying that he would not harm the Lord's anointed. Eventually, Saul's reign ended in tragedy when he died in battle, and David was anointed as king. David's reign was marked by great military victories and expansion. He established Jerusalem as the capital of Israel and brought the Ark of the Covenant, the symbol of God's presence, into the city. Jerusalem became not just a political center, but the spiritual heart of Israel. David was a man after God's own heart, known for his deep love for God and his desire to lead the people in worship. However, David was far from perfect. His greatest moral failure came when he committed adultery with Bathsheba, the wife of one of his most loyal soldiers, Uriah. To cover up his sin, David arranged for Uriah to be killed in battle. This sin brought turmoil to David's household, leading to rebellion and strife among his sons. Despite these personal failures, God made a significant promise to David. He vowed that one of David's descendants would establish an eternal kingdom, a promise that pointed to the future Messiah who would come through David's lineage. After David's death, his son Solomon took the throne. Solomon began his reign with great wisdom, asking God for the ability to rule justly. His wisdom became famous throughout the ancient world, and rulers from other nations came to hear him speak. Solomon also built the magnificent temple in Jerusalem, a place where God's presence would dwell among his people. However, Solomon's later years were marked by compromise. He married many foreign wives who led him into idolatry. His heart turned away from God, and as a result, the kingdom that David had worked so hard to unify began to fracture. In the next chapter, we'll explore the consequences of Solomon's compromises and the division of the kingdom, as well as the rise of the prophets who called the people back to righteousness in the midst of spiritual decline. Chapter 7: Exile and the Prophets, the Fall of Israel and Judah. After the death of Solomon, the once great kingdom of Israel was split into two: the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. This division weakened both nations and left them vulnerable to external threats. But even more dangerous than the political instability was the spiritual decay that plagued both kingdoms. The people of Israel and Judah turned away from God and began worshiping the idols of the surrounding nations. Despite repeated warnings from the prophets, the people continued to reject God's commandments and follow the corrupt practices of the nations around them. In the northern kingdom of Israel, most of the kings were corrupt, leading the people further into sin. Prophets like Elijah and Elisha were sent by God to call the people to repentance, performing miracles and confronting the evil rulers. One of the most dramatic also spoke of a future Messiah who would restore God's people, and bar moments came when Elijah faced off against the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel. Elijah called down fire from heaven to prove that Yahweh was the one true God. Despite this powerful display of God's might, the people continued in their rebellion. As a result, God allowed the northern kingdom of Israel to be conquered by the Assyrian Empire in 722 BC. The people were scattered, and Israel was no more. The southern kingdom of Judah fared slightly better, with a few good kings like Hezekiah and Josiah, who led the people back to God. However, Judah eventually fell into the same patterns of sin and idolatry. During this time, prophets like Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel delivered messages of warning and hope. They warned that Judah would face destruction if they didn't turn back to God, but they aimed peace to the world. Despite these warnings, Judah's leaders continued to ignore God's commands. In 586 BC, the Babylonian Empire, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, conquered Jerusalem, destroyed the temple, and carried the people of Judah into exile. This was a devastating blow for the Israelites, who had always seen Jerusalem and the temple as the center of their faith. It seemed as though all hope was lost. Yet, even in exile, God did not abandon his people. Through the prophets, he promised that the exile would not last forever. One day, the people would return to their land, and a descendant of David would establish an everlasting kingdom. The story of the exile is one of judgment but also of hope, a reminder that God's promises never fail. In the next chapter, we'll see how God's plan for redemption continues to unfold, even in the midst of exile, and how the prophecies of a coming Messiah give the people hope for a better future.